The following video is brought to you by Absolute Rentals, where A424 is our middle name. So we're here talking with Alan Howarth. Actually, it's Alan and Mark Slater, which is, there's Mark Slater over here, composer. Alan, composer, designer, special effects sound designer.
Sound effects specialist, and now sound researcher.
And sound researcher. And the subject for today is Alan's project of raw natural frequency music. What is that?
All right, so to discuss natural frequency music, I'll tell you my own personal experience. I think this is the best way to do it. In about 1992, I was given a book called The Rods of Amun-Ra. It was written by a fellow named Wesley H. Bateman. And Bateman had spent 25 years analyzing the architecture of the Great Pyramid in search of what we call sacred geometry. He was convinced that the original architects built that structure as a mathematical model to higher knowledge, so that if one would understand the architecture, then it would understand the math behind the architecture and the measurements. That's why he calls it the rods of Amun-Ra. So the rods are the measurements, and Amun-Ra was the sun god of Egypt. So in honor, because it was coming from Egypt, and Egypt sources, he called it Ra mathematics in this case. So in the book, which was an 800-page book, and I read it cover to cover, I was fascinated. Like, oh, this is unbelievable. I can't believe all this stuff. And after the end of it, he suggested that there would be frequencies described by the pyramid. And I went, well, I got to know about this. This sounds pretty cool. So it was a self-published book, and so I found his telephone number, and I called the guy up. I said, hey, Wes, I just read your book. Well, number one, he was thrilled that, one, somebody even read his book. And number two, was calling up to follow up on what he was talking about. And so we got into this discussion about why the pyramid is shaped like it is, and why the length of every stone means something, and it's this whole elaborate knowledge base that's been there for 5,000 plus years. So whoever understood this, I believe, and he agrees with me, sort of understood the creator's mathematics. This is what's being described as sort of the math of the third dimension. This is how the third dimension is put together from higher dimensions. So if we're in the higher dimension, obviously to continue to slow down, to become dense, to become from light to mass, which is sort of the E equals mc squared stuff, that's just a ratio. It turns out that there's ratios. So the two key ratios in the mathematics of the pyramid are pi and phi. Pi being a circle to its circumference, 3.141592876, da 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 da. It goes on forever. If you try to express these numbers decimally, they're infinite. So they're called irrational numbers. The same thing was the other one was called phi, or what we call the golden mean, and that's 1.618 da 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 da. It goes on forever. Well, in mathematics we call them irrational, but from Wes Bateman's viewpoint, they were from the infinite. They were numbers from a higher place, from another dimension that didn't resolve in the third dimension, and that these were key construction ratios that were described by the pyramid. So let's talk about the phi for a second. They're called the golden mean. So if you look at in a perfect face, beauty has all the perfect phi ratios, phi being 1.618. So if you looked at your hand and you call this first index finger 1 unit, the next part of your finger from here to here is 1.618 times longer than the first one. And if you take that one as a 1 and you compare this one down, 1.618 again. So this 1.618 is repeated throughout living things. And you see it in snail shells and ram's horns. You see it in the shape of sunflowers, as the way the seeds are laid out. And it's revealed in all this architecture, that the phi ratio is meaningful. And then you go to the pi ratio, and what's the pi thing all about? And the pi comes from circles or spheres. So in spherical geometry, let's go back to Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word. Well, the Word was a vibration, and that vibration occurred spherically and emitted from the source, the Big Bang, spherically in all directions, omnidirectional, and that's how things expand in the universe, is spherically. So this spherical geometry and this golden mean phi Fibonacci ratio thing, which is the whole thing the Da Vinci Code was about, was this Fibonacci curve, is all over the pyramid. And so I read his book, and I'm fascinated. So finally we get to the moment of deciphering mathematics to sound. something sitting there with a keyboard like this. It's a piano sound, but it's electronic. It's all digital, right? So you can retune this thing. It's not an acoustic piano. So it turns out that in the year 1925, the frequency of the note A was standardized to 440 cycles per second. That's an A at 440. But he plays me on an oscillator that's got numerically a frequency that he says is described by the pyramid. And it turns out that it's 423.97 cycles per second with a bunch of change on it because it's one of these weird non-resolving numbers. So I have to bend the piano down to match it. So it's not here. It's like the A wants to be around there to be 424. So if you go over the piano and you actually detune the instrument by minus 64 cents, which is about 5/8 flat, that makes the A 424 now. So that's the way you would do it to any instrument, to tune your instrument to this raw frequencies that we're talking about, or at least one of the raw frequencies. It turns out there's subtle changes, but let's just so let's go back just to standard for a second and play a piano in standard tuning. So here we go. That's the piano tuned to A440. All I'm going to do is retune the piano by minus 64. I'm going to play it again. And I'm sitting there listening to it, I'm going, golly, that sounds like a 17th century piano. Now, I don't really know what a 17th century piano sounds like, but it was my impression. It sounded old. It sounded like an old tuning. And Wes turns to me and he goes, "You're right." And I go, "What do you mean, right?" And he says, "I'm telling you, this was the tuning in the 17th century." So I did a little research on the internet, and unbelievable to my imagination, in the year 1711, a fellow named John Shore, who was the master trumpeter, cornetter at the English whatever, invents the first tuning fork, and it's tuned to 423.5. So this guy, with no calibration, with no instruments, no computers, picks a note that sounds right to him. Well, these tuning forks floated around in the 17th century, and Mozart's was tuned to 421.5. Handel was at 422.5, and there were several other ones that were in this 423 range with the standard from the guy from the English orchestra. So all the composers of that time were composing with their instruments tuned like this.
Yes.
And to really appreciate Mozart, to hear Handel as intended, the orchestra should be retuned to these frequencies. All right, so
Of course, the instruments were.
yeah, and all the instruments, were tuned with a little less tension. I think all these Stradivariuses and all these other stuff, when we use them today and tune to 440, we're actually putting more tension in them than was intended. And I did this to my piano up in the living room, and the piano loved it, because now the resonance of the tuning was in tune with the metal and the wood and all the stuff it's made out of, because this was the natural frequency family.